At 38 years old, Clara Whitlock had been cast out by the very railroad company her late father had served for 4 decades, dismissed after refusing to help conceal the quiet stripping of a dying branch line. And with only $9.40 stitched into the lining of her worn coat, she did the one thing every sensible soul in the valley considered foolish beyond forgiveness. She bought a lonely, abandoned roundhouse standing at the edge of Black Ash Crossing for $8, complete with a single rusted locomotive that no one had managed to move in nearly 20 years. Men standing outside the auction laughed until they wiped tears from their eyes. Women shook their heads with gentle pity, and even the auctioneer apologized before handing her the yellowed deed, believing he had witnessed desperation rather than determination. None of them imagined that something remained locked deep inside that forgotten engine, untouched through storms, wars, changing owners, and silent decades, waiting not merely to change one woman's fate, but to return hope to an entire town that had almost disappeared from the map. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Whitlock.
If you're watching from a place that feels forgotten, tell us in the comments where you're listening from, because sometimes the quietest places hold the greatest stories. If stories about forgotten places and quiet courage speak to your heart, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more unforgettable frontier stories every week. Now, let's get back to the story.
Long before Black Ash Crossing became a name spoken with sighs instead of pride, it had awakened every dawn beneath clouds of steam, whistles echoing through pine-covered hills as freight trains stitched together distant cities with farms, logging camps, and mountain settlements that depended upon the rails as faithfully as crops depended upon rain. It was the sort of town where everyone knew whose chimney smoked first each morning, whose horse preferred sugar cubes over oats, and whose porch welcomed strangers before questions ever followed. Among those familiar faces had always been Elijah Whitlock, locomotive mechanic, widower, patient teacher, and perhaps the gentlest pair of hands ever blackened by coal dust. His daughter Clara rarely remembered him without the scent of warm engine oil lingering upon his sleeves, or tiny flecks of soot resting in the creases beside his smile. While other fathers carried their daughters through fields, Elijah carried Clara through machine sheds, introducing her to pistons, rivets, boilers, valves, bearings, and wheels, as though each possessed a personality deserving respect. He insisted that every machine remembered the people who cared for it. Many laughed whenever he spoke that way. Clara never did. When she was 7 years old, she asked why he polished locomotives that had already been retired. He answered by placing her small hand upon cool iron. "Because," he whispered, "people only see what still earns money. A good craftsman remembers what carried everyone here before it was forgotten." Those words rooted themselves deeply inside her heart. Years passed with remarkable simplicity. Clara learned to repair broken clocks before she learned embroidery, could identify a damaged wheel bearing simply by listening to its rhythm, and discovered that rust often looked far worse than the metal hiding beneath it. Her father never measured wealth in coins. He measured it in trust. "If people know your hands are honest," he often said, "they'll remember your name longer than any fortune." Black Ash Crossing trusted Elijah completely. Farmers brought him broken tools that had nothing to do with railroads. Children carried cracked toys to his workshop because somehow he always found tiny screws nobody else possessed. Travelers stranded by broken wagon wheels received help before payment was ever discussed. Clara watched all of it. She noticed something else as well. Whenever someone truly could not pay, her father quietly invented reasons why the repair had required less work than expected. No one left ashamed. No one left believing charity had been placed into their hands. Instead, they walked away believing kindness had simply become ordinary. When Clara reached adulthood, many expected she would leave for a larger city where factories increasingly welcomed skilled mechanics, willing to work for lower wages than aging craftsmen. Yet she remained exactly where she had always belonged. Black Ash Crossing was shrinking, but shrinking things often required greater care than growing ones. The Roundhouse stood near the western edge of town, enormous and proud in those years, its brick walls glowing amber beneath sunrise, locomotives resting inside like sleeping giants, awaiting another day's labor. Clara spent countless afternoons sweeping workshop floors simply because it allowed her to remain near her father while he worked. Older mechanics teased her gently. They called her Little Lantern because she always carried questions brighter than the lantern hanging beside her. She wanted to know why steam sighed differently in winter than summer, why some engines sounded cheerful while others groaned, why iron cracked after certain storms, why experienced workers touched machines before examining them. The answers became pieces of her education. Then one bitter autumn morning, Elijah failed to arrive for work. Pneumonia settled into his lungs with frightening speed. Within 2 weeks, Black Ash Crossing buried one of its finest craftsmen beneath an old maple overlooking the tracks he had loved until his final breath. Clara believed grief might silence the town forever. Instead, she discovered what honest living leaves behind. The funeral overflowed with people. Rail workers stood shoulder to shoulder beside farmers. School children placed wildflowers upon the grave. Widows arrived carrying fresh bread because they remembered repairs Elijah had refused payment for 20 years earlier. No speeches celebrated wealth. They celebrated character. Standing beneath gray skies, Clara silently promised she would spend whatever years remained to her honoring that inheritance. She kept working around the railroad, first maintaining records, later supervising inventory, eventually becoming one of the few people who understood both the machinery and the paperwork supporting every mile of track winding through the valley. The position suited her. She noticed details others ignored: missing bolts, changed invoices, repairs approved but never completed, equipment marked as unusable despite functioning perfectly well. At first, such irregularities appeared ordinary enough to explain away. Companies grew larger. Managers changed. Bookkeeping became increasingly complicated. But little by little, the spirit her father had cherished faded beneath new leadership that measured every decision by immediate profit. The old station master retired. The senior mechanics accepted pensions. Investors from distant cities purchased controlling interests in the regional railway. Young executives arrived wearing polished shoes that somehow remained spotless despite walking across coal yards. They spoke confidently about efficiency. They spoke less often about people. Clara rarely argued. She simply observed. Observation, after all, had always been her strongest skill. Years slipped quietly onward. The timber industry slowed. Nearby mines produced less ore. Freight schedules shortened. Families relocated westward seeking opportunity. Empty storefronts appeared one by one along Main Street until silence became almost as common as conversation. Even so, Black Ash Crossing endured. Its people adapted. Neighbors shared harvests. Church suppers stretched thin ingredients into generous meals. Children still laughed along dusty roads. The town survived because those who remained refused to surrender one another. Then Edwin Mercer arrived. He introduced himself as the railway's new regional director, though most residents first noticed his expensive pocket watch and polished carriage before remembering his name. Mercer possessed the rare talent of making kindness sound like a business strategy instead of a human instinct. He praised tradition publicly, while quietly arranging contracts that dismantled everything tradition had built. Within months, repair budgets disappeared. Experienced workers were dismissed. Perfectly serviceable equipment received bright red paint, declaring it obsolete. Entire sidings vanished beneath salvage crews. Mercer insisted modernization required sacrifice. Most believed him. After all, numbers printed neatly upon ledgers often persuade people more quickly than the voices of neighbors. Clara, however, continued comparing inventory records against shipping manifests. The numbers refused to agree. Engines listed as dismantled appeared to have vanished without documentation. Machinery supposedly sold for scrap generated suspiciously little income. Crates marked empty somehow required armed transport. Questions multiplied. Answers never came. One rainy evening, while organizing decades of maintenance journals inside a storage office scheduled for demolition, Clara discovered several ledgers prepared by her father shortly before his death. Tucked carefully between inspection reports rested handwritten notes describing locomotive transfers, sealed cargo manifests, and maintenance orders involving one particular engine stored inside the western stall of the old Roundhouse. The locomotive carried only a faded number, 47. Beside that number, Elijah had written a single, unusual sentence. Never separate the engine from its final commission. No explanation followed, only those words. Clara frowned thoughtfully. The locomotive had disappeared from official records years earlier. Yet she distinctly remembered seeing its weathered silhouette standing motionless inside the abandoned roundhouse every time she passed the property. Why would an engine erased from company books still remain exactly where it had supposedly never existed? The question lingered quietly in her thoughts. She intended to investigate after finishing work. She never received the opportunity. The following afternoon, Mercer summoned her into his office, overlooking the nearly empty rail yard. Rain tapped gently against tall windows. Fresh maps covered his desk. Without inviting her to sit, he slid several documents across polished wood. I understand you've been reviewing records beyond your responsibilities. Clara met his gaze calmly. I've been correcting inconsistencies. He smiled without warmth. An admirable habit. Silence settled. Then he leaned back. The company requires loyal employees. I've always been loyal. To the railroad, Mercer corrected softly. Not to old memories. He opened a ledger already marked with colored ribbons. There are assets scheduled for liquidation. I know. You'll certify the paperwork. She examined the pages. Entire workshops appeared listed below market value. Historic equipment had been classified as worthless. Several buildings still actively serving nearby communities had already been declared abandoned. Her father's handwriting echoed within memory. People only see what still earns money. She slowly placed the papers back upon the desk. I can't certify records I know are false. Mercer's pleasant expression disappeared so gradually it felt colder than anger. They're not false. They're convenient. Outside, somewhere beyond the rain, an aging locomotive released one lonely whistle that drifted across the valley like a farewell from another generation. Neither of them spoke for several long moments. Finally, Mercer folded the documents with careful precision. I hoped, he said quietly, that your reputation would make this easier. So did I. He pressed a small brass bell resting near his elbow. An assistant entered almost immediately. Miss Whitlock's employment concludes today. The words arrived without raised voices, without insults, without spectacle. Sometimes the deepest betrayals wear remarkably polite faces. Clara stood quietly, gathered the satchel containing her father's worn notebooks, thanked the bewildered assistant who could barely meet her eyes, and walked through the familiar offices one final time. Workers who had known her for years looked down at their desks, uncertain whether courage or caution should guide them. She blamed none of them. Fear had become another tool of the company, as useful as ink, coal, or steel. When she stepped outside, the rain had stopped. Across the yard, beyond rusting rails already sprouting stubborn weeds, the abandoned roundhouse rested beneath gathering evening clouds, and inside its open doorway the forgotten outline of Locomotive 47 waited exactly where it had waited for years, silent, unmoving, and somehow impossible to ignore. Without realizing it, Clara had already begun walking toward the mystery that would ask everything of her. She stopped only when the old fence bordering the abandoned railway property stood between her and the roundhouse, its weathered posts leaning at tired angles, as though even the timber had grown weary of waiting for trains that would never arrive again. Evening settled gently across Black Ash Crossing, washing the brick walls in muted shades of bronze and gray. Wind slipped through broken window panes, carrying the faint scent of rust, damp earth, and ancient coal dust that no rain had ever completely washed away. Clara rested one hand upon the splintered fence and looked toward the silent locomotive standing in the western stall. Even from a distance, number 47 seemed different from the other abandoned engines scattered throughout forgotten rail yards across the region. Most rusted locomotives looked defeated. This one looked patient. It was as though it had chosen not to move until someone worthy finally returned. She almost smiled at herself for entertaining such a thought, remembering how many times people had laughed when her father claimed machines remembered kindness. Yet standing there, alone beneath the fading sky, she found herself placing quiet trust in feelings she could not fully explain. The following morning, she returned to the small boarding house, where she rented a narrow upstairs room. Mrs. Eleanor Pike, the widow who managed the building, noticed the folded dismissal letter before Clara had even removed her coat. "They let you go," the older woman whispered softly. Clara nodded. Mrs. Pike poured tea without another question, understanding that some wounds needed silence before conversation. The widow listened as Clara explained Mercer's demand to approve false records. When the story ended, Mrs. Pike simply reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Then they dismissed the wrong person. Clara thanked her, though gratitude did little to answer practical concerns. Rent would soon come due. The few savings she possessed had nearly vanished after helping repair the church roof the previous winter, and assisting neighbors whose harvest had failed. Counting every coin that evening produced only $9.40. It looked painfully small, lying upon the quilt beside her father's notebooks. She turned each coin slowly between her fingers, before carefully returning them to a cloth purse. $9.40. That was everything separating her from complete ruin. During the next several days, she searched honestly for work. She repaired broken farm tools, she sharpened kitchen knives, she mended 2 sewing machines for the school teacher, and fixed the bell mechanism in the town hall without charging a penny because children deserved to hear it ring properly again. People appreciated her skills, yet nobody possessed enough money to hire her permanently. Black Ash Crossing itself struggled merely to survive. Then notices appeared, announcing the county auction of abandoned railway properties scheduled for Saturday afternoon. Most residents paid little attention. Investors from larger towns would purchase the land for lumber or salvage, everyone assumed, while the remaining structures would eventually disappear beneath weeds. Clara attended only because curiosity drew her toward the old roundhouse. She stood quietly near the back while auctioneers hurried through lists of neglected sheds, storage buildings, water towers, empty freight platforms, and collapsed depots. Bidding remained modest. Most buyers intended only to dismantle whatever they acquired. Finally, the auctioneer adjusted his spectacles and unfolded another paper. Property 23. Former Black Ash Crossing Roundhouse and surrounding yard. Includes abandoned locomotive identified as number 47. Building condemned. Engine immovable. Minimum opening bid, $8. Silence answered him. A few men exchanged amused glances. One scratched his beard before shaking his head. Costs more to tear it down, someone muttered. Laughter drifted lightly through the gathering. The auctioneer cleared his throat. $8? Again, no answer came. Clara looked down at the cloth purse hidden beneath her coat. $8 would leave only $1.40. No sensible person would make such a purchase. She understood that perfectly. Yet another memory surfaced from her father's notebooks. Never separate the engine from its final commission. She raised her hand. $8. Heads turned instantly. A ripple of disbelief spread across the crowd. One man laughed openly, before nudging his companion. "Whitlock's finally lost her senses," another called out. "Planning to start your own railroad with one dead engine?" Even the auctioneer hesitated. "Miss Whitlock, you understand the condition of the property?" "I do. The locomotive has not moved in almost 20 years. I know. The roof leaks." "Yes. The building has no commercial value," Clara answered with quiet certainty. "Perhaps not to everyone." The auctioneer waited another moment for competing bids that never arrived. His hammer struck the wooden block with a sharp crack that echoed strangely across the nearly empty rail yard. "Sold. $8. More laughter followed, though not all of it sounded cruel. Some pitied her. Others simply believed desperation had clouded good judgment. Clara walked forward, accepted the fated deed, counted $8 into the auctioneer's waiting hand, and folded the document carefully inside her satchel. When she checked her purse afterward, $1.40 remained. Everything she owned in the world could now fit inside a single room and one abandoned roundhouse. That evening, Mrs. Pike stared at the deed in astonishment. "You bought the old roundhouse?" Clara nodded. "People think I'm foolish. Do you?" Clara considered the question thoughtfully. "I think my father wanted me to find something." Mrs. Pike studied her face for several quiet moments before smiling gently. "Then I hope he left good directions." The following sunrise found Clara standing before her newly purchased property, carrying little more than a lantern, a toolbox, heavy gloves, a broom, fresh lamp oil, and Elijah Whitlock's notebooks. The large wooden doors protested loudly as she pushed them open. Dust floated through shafts of morning light. Pigeons fluttered upward into cracked rafters before disappearing through broken windows. The great circular turntable occupying the center of the building had long ago frozen in place beneath rust and weeds. Nature had slowly reclaimed everything abandoned by men. Yet despite years of neglect, the roundhouse retained a strange dignity. Brick walls still stood firm. Massive roof beams remained surprisingly straight. Rain had entered through missing shingles, but the foundation appeared solid. Clara spent hours sweeping pathways through decades of dust, removing fallen branches, clearing nests, and opening windows that had not welcomed fresh air in years. Each small accomplishment made the building feel less forgotten. By afternoon, she finally approached Locomotive 47. Up close, its age revealed itself in countless details. Layers of soot clung stubbornly beneath rust. Brass fittings had dulled almost black. The smokestack leaned slightly. One driving wheel rested upon warped rail. Thick chains wrapped around portions of the machinery, where salvage crews had once intended removal, before apparently abandoning the effort. She placed one gloved hand against the cold iron boiler, exactly as she had done countless times beside her father. The metal felt strangely smooth beneath accumulated grime, almost as though many hands had touched this particular place long ago. Her fingers traced the faded numbers painted upon the cab. 47, nothing more. No company emblem remained visible, no destination, no owner's mark. Only the number survived. Clara circled the locomotive slowly, observing every bolt, rivet, valve, and wheel with practiced eyes. Something immediately seemed unusual. The engine carried far less weather damage than expected, considering 2 decades of abandonment. Several access panels appeared unusually well sealed. Hinges remained tightly fitted despite surrounding corrosion. It almost resembled an engine carefully prepared for storage rather than discarded after failure. She opened the firebox, empty. She examined the water tank, dry. She inspected brake assemblies and connecting rods. Worn, but remarkably complete. Most abandoned locomotives had valuable components stripped long before reaching such conditions. 47 remained surprisingly untouched. Why? She whispered into the quiet building. No answer came beyond distant pigeons shifting overhead. She climbed carefully into the cab where faded wooden controls waited beneath layers of dust. Spiderwebs stretched between pressure gauges frozen forever at 0. She gently cleaned one brass plate using a cloth from her pocket. Tiny engraved letters slowly emerged. Harrison Ironworks, Pittsburgh, 1871. Older than she had imagined. She opened storage compartments built into the cab. Most stood empty except for brittle scraps of paper, rusted tools, and one cracked leather glove. Beneath the engineer's seat, she discovered a narrow locked drawer. Its brass keyhole remained surprisingly clean. She searched every shelf and compartment for a key but found none. The drawer refused to budge. Curious, she remembered her father's habit of never forcing locks before understanding why they existed. Instead, she continued exploring. Behind the tender, she noticed another oddity. Heavy iron chains secured a reinforced cargo compartment, unlike any ordinary freight attachment she had encountered. The compartment possessed thick steel walls riveted directly into the rear section of the locomotive. No external hinges appeared visible. Only a square locking mechanism occupied its center, protected beneath an iron cover designed to shield it from weather. Clara knelt closer. Dust lay thick upon every surface, except around the lock itself, where faint scratches suggested someone had attempted opening it years before. Not recently. Long ago. She brushed away loose dirt. Stamped beneath the lock appeared unfamiliar words. Federal Transit Commission. Secure Conveyance Division. Her heartbeat slowed. She had never heard of such a division. Neither had her father mentioned it directly, though his mysterious note suddenly seemed far more significant. Never separate the engine from its final commission. This cargo compartment had clearly been built for something extraordinary. She examined every edge, searching for weaknesses, but found none. Whoever designed it intended whatever rested inside to remain protected against theft, weather, fire, and time itself. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor before Clara finally climbed down from the locomotive. She felt equal parts excitement and frustration. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Why had company records erased 47? Why abandon such an unusual engine? Why leave an apparently secure cargo compartment untouched for 20 years? Most importantly, what commission had Elijah believed remained unfinished? Exhausted, she resumed cleaning. While sweeping debris beneath the locomotive, she heard the broom strike something hollow beneath accumulated dirt. Kneeling, she cleared away years of dust until a small iron floor grate emerged between the rails. It blended so perfectly into the concrete that few people would ever notice it. A rusted ring allowed the grate to lift after considerable effort. Cool air drifted upward, carrying the scent of damp stone. Beneath lay a narrow maintenance pit running beneath the locomotive's entire length. Clara lowered her lantern carefully before climbing down an old iron ladder. The underground passage remained remarkably dry. Shelves carved into the walls held forgotten tools wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them against moisture. Most had decayed beyond use, yet someone had organized everything with meticulous care. She moved slowly beneath the engine, raising her lantern toward the underside of the cargo compartment. There, hidden from anyone standing above, she found something no auction notice, railway inventory, or company ledger had ever mentioned. Bolted beneath the reinforced compartment rested a small watertight brass cylinder scarcely longer than her forearm. Unlike every surrounding surface, the cylinder gleamed faintly beneath layers of dust. Someone had polished it before securing it in place. 4 brass bolts held it firmly against the locomotive's frame. Each bolt carried tiny stamped initials that made Clara's breath catch. E.W. Elijah Whitlock. Her father had been here, not merely inspecting the locomotive years ago, but deliberately fastening this hidden cylinder where only a mechanic crawling beneath the engine would ever discover it. With trembling hands, she carefully loosened the bolts one by one, unaware that the first true secret of Locomotive 47 was finally about to reveal itself. The final brass bolt released with a quiet metallic click that echoed softly through the maintenance pit, and Clara lowered the cylinder into her hands with the care one might use for a sleeping child. Though decades had passed, the rubber seals remained intact, preserving whatever rested inside from moisture and decay. She climbed carefully back into the fading daylight, carrying the cylinder to an old workbench near the locomotive, where shafts of evening sun still reached through broken windows. Her father's initials stared back at her from the polished brass. Elijah Whitlock had hidden this deliberately, not for himself, for someone who would one day understand where to look. She unscrewed the heavy cap with steady hands. At first, nothing emerged except the faint scent of machine oil and old paper. Then she gently tipped the cylinder, and 3 tightly rolled documents wrapped in waxed cloth slid onto the bench beside a small iron key attached to a faded blue ribbon. The ribbon had nearly lost its color, but Elijah's careful knot remained untouched. Clara closed her eyes for a long moment. She could almost picture him sitting at this very bench, quietly preparing these items, while the roundhouse bustled with life around him, never imagining how many years would pass before his daughter discovered them. The first document proved to be a handwritten letter addressed simply, "To the one who still believes honest work matters." Clara recognized her father's handwriting immediately. "If these pages have reached you," it began, "then those entrusted with this railroad have likely forgotten what it was built to protect. Do not believe anyone who says Dirchings. Number 47 carried only freight. Its final commission was never completed, because completion required honesty that certain men feared more than failure itself. I could not finish what began before me, but I have hidden enough that another may." Clara read every line slowly, her pulse quickening with each sentence. Elijah explained that shortly before his death, he had uncovered evidence that the railway's founders had created a protected transport system after the Civil War to safeguard community trust funds collected from dozens of struggling frontier towns. Rather than storing all reserves inside distant banks vulnerable to corruption or collapse, small communities pooled emergency savings, land deeds, school endowments, hospital funds, and veterans' pensions into secure railway transports that moved quietly between trusted stations. 47 had served as one of those protected carriers. Its reinforced compartment had never been designed for gold shipments or military secrets. It carried the legal records proving ownership of land, water rights, charitable trusts, and community investments belonging to ordinary people. During one final journey decades earlier, reports of organized theft along several railway routes forced federal officials to order the locomotive hidden temporarily inside Black Ash Crossing's Roundhouse until inspectors could safely retrieve its cargo. But before that retrieval occurred, a devastating bridge collapse farther north interrupted the line. Company ownership changed repeatedly, records vanished, officials retired or died, and the existence of 47 slowly disappeared beneath bureaucratic confusion. Some confusion, Elijah wrote, is merely neglect. Other confusion is carefully encouraged. Clara swallowed hard. The next document contained engineering drawings of the cargo compartment itself. Her father had carefully marked hidden release mechanisms invisible from the outside. Beside one drawing, he had written another note. "The iron key opens only the first lock." She picked up the small key resting beside the papers. It looked ordinary, yet its teeth had been cut with extraordinary precision. The third document surprised her most. It was a ledger listing dozens of frontier communities, dates, and sealed deposit references, stretching back nearly 30 years. Black Ash Crossing appeared among them, along with neighboring settlements that no longer even existed. Several entries bore neat check marks. Others remained blank. The final unchecked entry matched the date associated with 47's disappearance. Elijah had circled it in red pencil. Evening shadows lengthened across the roundhouse floor. Clara folded everything carefully and slipped the papers into her satchel before approaching the reinforced cargo compartment once more. She inserted the small iron key into the outer lock. It fit perfectly. Turning it required considerable effort, as though decades of silence resisted movement. At last, something shifted deep inside the mechanism. A heavy click echoed through the locomotive, yet the compartment remained closed. Remembering the engineering drawings, Clara searched beneath a concealed lip along the lower edge. Her fingers located a tiny recessed lever almost invisible beneath rust. She pulled gently. Hidden gears awakened with surprising smoothness. Thick steel bolts withdrew into the frame one after another until the entire reinforced door eased outward by only a fraction of an inch before stopping completely. A second lock still held it firmly shut. She smiled despite herself. Her father had been right. The iron key opened only the first lock. The second required another method entirely. She studied the engineering drawing again beneath lantern light. Instead of describing another key, Elijah had written 6 words. Truth unlocks what greed cannot open. She frowned. It sounded less like mechanical instruction than personal advice. Before she could think further, footsteps crunched outside the roundhouse. Clara quickly extinguished the lantern and slipped behind the locomotive. Voices drifted through the open doorway. I saw light in here, one man whispered. She'll be poking around. Another voice answered quietly. Clara recognized it immediately. Edwin Mercer. Search carefully, he said. If Whitlock found anything, I want it before sunrise. Clara remained perfectly still as 3 lanterns moved slowly through the building. Mercer himself never entered deeply, choosing instead to remain near the doorway, while 2 hired laborers examined abandoned workbenches and storage rooms. She's only a dismissed clerk, one man muttered. Mercer answered with unsettling calm. She's Elijah Whitlock's daughter. Never underestimate habits passed from parent to child. Clara's heart pounded. He knew about Elijah. Perhaps not everything, but enough to worry. One laborer approached the locomotive, his lantern illuminating the maintenance pit entrance. Looks like someone's been cleaning. Mercer stepped closer. His polished boots stopped only yards away. Interesting. He rested one gloved hand upon 47's rusted side. This engine has attracted entirely too much attention. For one terrifying moment, Clara feared he might discover the loosened brass cylinder mount beneath the locomotive. Said. Another worker called from across the building. Sir, fresh footprints over here. Mercer turned away. We'll return tomorrow with more men. Lock the gate. Their footsteps gradually disappeared into the night. Clara waited several long minutes before daring to move. She now understood the danger far more clearly. Mercer wanted something connected to 47. Whether he understood its true purpose remained uncertain, but he clearly intended to prevent anyone else from discovering it first. Before leaving, Clara concealed the maintenance pit again and carried every document back to Mrs. Pike's boarding house. The widow listened without interruption as Clara explained the contents of Elijah's letter. When she finished, Mrs. Pike stared thoughtfully into the fireplace. My husband used to speak about community reserve funds, she said quietly. People thought he meant ordinary savings. Clara looked up. You never mentioned that before. Because after he died, nobody else remembered. Mrs. Pike rose slowly and crossed to an old cabinet. From its lowest drawer, she removed a small wooden box containing yellowed papers tied with twine. These belonged to Thomas. He served on the town council years ago. Together they examined the contents. Among tax receipts and meeting notes lay one folded letter bearing the same Federal Transit Commission seal Clara had seen stamped beneath the cargo compartment. The letter confirmed that Black Ash Crossing had contributed significant funds toward a regional emergency trust protecting schools, orphanages, bridges, wells, and medical clinics throughout the valley. The final line caught Clara's attention immediately. Distribution shall occur only upon presentation of complete transport authorization. Complete transport authorization. Elijah had hinted that 47 still carried unfinished business. Perhaps whatever remained inside the cargo compartment included those missing authorizations. If so, enormous portions of forgotten community property could still legally belong to the towns rather than the railway company claiming abandoned assets. Sleep proved impossible that night. Clara spread maps, ledgers, and engineering drawings across her small table until dawn. One pattern slowly emerged. Every unchecked ledger entry corresponded with land now quietly owned by shell companies linked through recent purchases to Mercer himself. Wells, timber tracts, grain warehouses, bridge crossings, even abandoned schoolhouses. Individually, they appeared insignificant. Together, they formed an astonishing network across the valley. If Mercer controlled those properties using incomplete or fraudulent ownership claims, the sealed documents inside 47 threatened everything he had built. Clara visited the county courthouse the following afternoon, requesting old property indexes under the pretense of historical research. Elderly clerk Benjamin Holloway greeted her warmly. Miss Whitlock, he smiled sadly. I heard about the railroad. So has everyone. Their loss. Benjamin quietly unlocked shelves rarely visited anymore. For hours, Clara compared deeds with Elijah's ledger. Again, the discrepancies appeared. Entire parcels had transferred ownership despite missing original documentation. Several legal references simply stated, supporting records unavailable. Benjamin adjusted his spectacles while studying one page. Curious, he murmured. I remember these files existing years ago. Where did they go? He shrugged slowly. Someone requested them before the archives moved. Who? The clerk hesitated. Regional Railway Council. Mercer's office. Clara thanked him and returned toward town, carrying fresh concern. She had barely reached Main Street when 2 well-dressed strangers stepped from a waiting carriage. "Miss Whitlock?" one asked politely. "Yes." He presented a business card bearing the railway company's seal. "Mr. Mercer requests a conversation. I'm no longer employed. This concerns your property." Clara's expression remained calm. "My property? The Roundhouse. What about it?" "The company has decided it was sold in error." She almost laughed. "I purchased it legally." "Perhaps. Nevertheless, Mr. Mercer is prepared to offer $25 if you'll return the deed immediately." $25, more than triple her purchase price after only 2 days. Clara understood exactly what the offer revealed. Mercer was frightened. "Please thank Mr. Mercer," she replied evenly. "But the property is not for sale." The strangers exchanged disappointed glances before climbing back into the carriage. Clara watched them depart without looking back. By sunset, rumors already spread through Black Ash Crossing that wealthy railway officials wanted the abandoned roundhouse returned. Townspeople who had laughed at the auction now exchanged puzzled whispers outside shops and churches. Why would successful businessmen suddenly value a building they had declared worthless only days earlier? Questions awakened curiosity. Curiosity slowly awakened memory. Elderly residents began recalling stories about mysterious government inspectors visiting the roundhouse decades earlier. Former railway workers remembered unusual security surrounding number 47 before it disappeared from official conversation. Fragments of forgotten history resurfaced one conversation at a time. Mercer noticed the change as well. His confidence hardened into urgency. 3 nights later, while Clara locked the roundhouse doors after another day of careful investigation, she discovered fresh wagon tracks circling the building and new boot prints leading toward the locomotive. Someone had entered while she was away. Nothing appeared stolen. Nothing seemed disturbed. Yet resting upon the engineer's seat inside 47 lay a single folded note written in elegant handwriting. "Some locks," it read, "remain closed because opening them destroys everyone nearby. Walk away while you still can." Clara folded the warning quietly and slipped it into her pocket. Then she looked once more toward the sealed cargo compartment. Instead of frightening her, the threat confirmed one simple truth. Whatever rested beyond that second lock was valuable enough for powerful men to fear its discovery more than public suspicion itself. The morning after Clara found the warning, the valley awakened beneath a sky washed clean by overnight rain. Mist drifted between the pines, softening the outlines of abandoned trestles and silent sidings, until the old railroad seemed suspended somewhere between memory and hope. Clara returned to the roundhouse carrying everything Elijah had left her, determined that fear would not finish what dishonesty had begun. She studied the engineering drawings again, tracing every measurement with patient fingers. Her father had hidden more than instructions. Along the margin of one page, so faint she had overlooked it before, he had penciled a sequence of dates corresponding not to railroad schedules, but to the charter dates of every town listed in the ledger. Beside the final date, representing Black Ash Crossing, he had written only one sentence: "The last witness completes the commission." Clara's thoughts returned to elderly Benjamin Holloway at the courthouse, and to Mrs. Pike's late husband, both of whom had served their community when the trust still existed. If the compartment required more than a mechanical key, perhaps it also required lawful witnesses, just as the original transfer had. Before noon, she gathered Benjamin Holloway, Mrs. Pike, Pastor Amos Bell, and retired blacksmith Henry Colton, the oldest surviving citizens whose names appeared in faded council records connected to the original community trust. They followed her into the roundhouse with quiet curiosity, each carrying memories older than many buildings still standing. Clara showed them Elijah's letter, the engineering drawings, and the federal seal. One by one, they nodded as forgotten recollections returned. Henry remembered watching armed inspectors escort number 47 into the roundhouse. Benjamin recalled filing preliminary ownership notices that were never completed after officials disappeared. Mrs. Pike produced her husband's council journal confirming the town's participation in the regional trust. Pastor Bell quietly removed an even older church register recording donations collected for widows, veterans, schools, and wells after a devastating drought decades earlier. Together, the scattered pieces formed a history no single person had remembered alone. Clara inserted the iron key into the first lock once more. The heavy bolts withdrew as before. Then, following Elijah's final notation, she asked each witness to speak aloud the name of the town they had served. "Black Ash Crossing," Benjamin declared. "Black Ash Crossing," repeated Mrs. Pike. Henry's weathered voice joined theirs, followed by Pastor Bell's calm affirmation. As the fourth voice faded into the quiet building, Clara noticed a small brass plate beside the second lock shift, almost imperceptibly. Hidden beneath years of grime lay 4 narrow slots. She realized the dates on Elijah's drawing corresponded to numbered wheels concealed beneath the plate. Turning each wheel to the charter year recorded in the documents, aligned the mechanism exactly as intended. The second lock released with a deep metallic sound, unlike anything heard inside the Roundhouse for more than 20 years. No explosion of treasure greeted them. No glittering mountain of gold waited behind the steel door. Instead, shelves lined the reinforced compartment from floor to ceiling, each holding sealed iron document chests wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Every chest carried the name of a frontier community together, with official federal markings certifying protected custody. Clara lifted the chest labeled Black Ash Crossing onto a nearby table. Benjamin's hands trembled as he unlocked it, using the small inspection key resting inside the compartment. Within lay property deeds, trust certificates, signed railway agreements, engineering surveys, water rights, bridge contracts, veterans' pension records, and investment bonds purchased generations earlier for the benefit of the town. At the very bottom rested the original transport authorization, awaiting final confirmation that had never come. The commission had remained unfinished, not because anything was lost, but because no lawful witnesses had survived to complete it until now. Tears filled Mrs. Pike's eyes. Thomas searched for these until the week before he died, she whispered. The neighboring chests told similar stories. Communities believed bankrupt still legally owned timber rights. Schools thought abandoned possessed funded endowments. Orphanages that had closed for lack of support still held investment certificates that had quietly grown in value over decades. The forgotten cargo carried by 47 was not private wealth, but the legal proof restoring entire communities to what had always belonged to them. Clara understood immediately why Mercer had feared the locomotive. His network of shell companies depended upon missing records. Once these documents entered public record again, countless fraudulent claims would collapse under their own weight. She wasted no time. Instead of hiding the discovery, she requested a special county hearing and invited representatives from every town named in Elijah's ledger. Word spread through the valley with astonishing speed. Families traveled from settlements nearly erased from maps. Elderly men carried yellowed receipts inherited from parents who had insisted the community trust had once existed. Women arrived with diaries, letters, and faded meeting minutes, supporting the records Clara had uncovered. By the day of the hearing, the courthouse overflowed with people whose lives had quietly intersected through forgotten history. Edwin Mercer appeared as well, accompanied by attorneys carrying polished briefcases and expressions of practiced confidence. He argued that abandoned railway assets legally transferred to corporate ownership decades earlier. Clara never interrupted him. When he finished, she calmly placed the sealed federal chests before the county judge one by one. Benjamin Holloway identified the original filing procedures. Pastor Bell authenticated church registers, matching the trust contributions. Mrs. Pike presented council journals. Henry Colton confirmed the original delivery of 47. Finally, Clara unfolded Elijah Whitlock's engineering drawings, explaining how the cargo compartment had remained sealed because its lawful commission had never been completed. The judge requested every document for examination. Hours passed in careful silence while clerks compared signatures, seals, and archival references. Mercer's attorneys grew steadily less confident. Every missing property record they claimed had vanished forever, emerged instead from the locomotive's carefully preserved cargo. Survey maps matched existing boundaries precisely. Deeds carried official federal certifications. Trust certificates remained legally enforceable because no authorized officer had ever closed the transport. By sunset, the judge rendered a decision that echoed far beyond Black Ash Crossing. The recovered documents were declared authentic. Ownership immediately reverted according to the original trust agreements. Fraudulent transfers executed without supporting records would undergo independent review. Mercer himself was ordered to surrender all related files pending investigation. No dramatic outburst followed. Mercer simply lowered his eyes as years of carefully assembled deception unraveled beneath quiet truth. The same politeness with which he had dismissed Clara now accompanied his own downfall. He left the courthouse through a side entrance without speaking to reporters or townspeople waiting outside. Justice, Clara realized, rarely required humiliation. It required only light. The months that followed transformed the valley more gently than anyone expected. Rather than dividing the recovered assets among individuals, the communities honored the original purpose of the trust. Timber revenues repaired neglected bridges. Water rights restored aging wells. School endowments reopened classrooms. Veterans' pensions reached descendants who had unknowingly inherited them. A small medical clinic welcomed patients again after standing empty for years. Black Ash Crossing rebuilt its library. The old station became a community workshop where young apprentices learned trades nearly forgotten. Clara accepted no personal fortune beyond reimbursement for restoring the roundhouse itself. Whenever officials suggested rewarding her with a substantial percentage of the recovered value, she declined with the same quiet conviction her father had lived by. It was never mine, she told them. I simply carried it to where it belonged. Instead, she asked for one thing alone. Number 47 would remain inside the restored roundhouse exactly where history had left it. The request was granted unanimously. Volunteers arrived from every surrounding town to repair the roof, replace broken windows, strengthen the brickwork, and restore the turntable. Retired mechanics taught younger workers how to polish brass fittings, rebuild wooden benches, and preserve iron without erasing its age. Children wandered through the completed building listening to stories of locomotives that had once connected distant lives. Above the entrance, they hung a modest wooden sign bearing 4 simple words: Whitlock Community Roundhouse. Clara protested at first, insisting her father's name deserved the honor more than hers. The townspeople smiled knowingly. We named it for both of you, Mrs. Pike replied. One prepared the way, the other finished the journey. Years later, travelers passing through the valley often paused before number 47, wondering why such an ordinary-looking rusted locomotive occupied the center of a beautifully restored roundhouse. Guides never began by describing locks or hidden documents. They began with the story of a woman whom everyone believed had wasted $8 on a forgotten building. They explained how laughter sometimes reveals more about certainty than wisdom, and how overlooked things often wait patiently for someone willing to ask better questions. Clara herself continued repairing clocks, tools, and farm equipment much as her father once had. Children still carried broken toys to her workbench. Farmers still stopped by, seeking advice rather than invoices. Whenever someone praised her for saving the valley, she gently corrected them. The valley saved itself, she would answer. People simply remembered what they already owned. Looking back, it became impossible not to hear echoes of the story's beginning. A 38-year-old woman had stood nearly penniless, with only $9.40, dismissed for refusing dishonesty, and mocked for purchasing a lonely, abandoned roundhouse that everyone else considered worthless. The building had indeed contained something sealed away through storms, changing owners, and passing decades. Yet the greatest treasure had never been hidden inside iron chests alone. It rested in the truth that communities become strongest when ordinary people choose stewardship over possession, honesty over convenience, and shared restoration over personal gain. Elijah Whitlock had once taught his daughter that people often see value only in what still earns money. Clara proved that forgotten promises may become the richest inheritance of all when someone refuses to let them disappear. The lonely roundhouse no longer stood lonely. Children's laughter echoed beneath its restored roof. Lanterns glowed warmly through its windows each evening. The locomotive that had once seemed abandoned became a monument not to wealth but to trust, faithfully carried across generations. And whenever visitors asked why the engine had never been moved from its original stall, the townspeople answered with quiet smiles that some journeys are completed without traveling another mile. Thank you for spending this time with us and walking beside Clara Whitlock through a story of quiet courage, forgotten promises, and the extraordinary value hidden inside things the world is too quick to abandon. If this story stayed with you, we hope you'll share it with someone who might need the reminder that integrity is never wasted, even when it appears to cost everything. Before you go, tell us in the comments, what is a time you found value in something others had written off? We always enjoy reading your stories. Until next time, stay close.
Thank you for spending this time with us. If Clara's story meant something to you, please like this video and subscribe, and share it with someone who loves stories of hope. Before you go, tell us in the comments, what's a time you found value in something everyone else had written off? We love reading your stories.